Hi, and welcome to the Courtenay Turner podcast. I'm your host, Courtenay, and I'm super passionate about moving and thinking. On this show, we are going to dive into all things health, fitness, personal development, lifestyle, and political sociocultural. I've always been fascinated by people, and I love learning from the experiences and stories of others. This has been a treat for me, and I hope this is enjoyable and useful for you. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or any way that I can make this a better experience for you, please don't hesitate to reach out. Hello, welcome to the Courtenay Turner podcast. I am here today with my friend Max, who is a teacher. He teaches prep school, and he also does seminars in civics and history. How are you doing today, Max?
I'm doing fine. How are you doing, Courtenay?
I'm doing well, thanks. Well,
Thanks for having me here. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for doing this. Yeah, I'm super excited. So we're under some pretty crazy times right now, would you say?
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. I know it's been a very tumultuous period in American history. We've known each other for a while now, and you know it. I'm all over it, and people keep reaching out to me and talking to me about it. And it's pretty dark. What did Biden say? He called it the dark winter or something like that, or the black times, or the new Middle Ages, or the dark ages. Maybe he should have called it the dark ages. Would have been better, I think. Maybe that's what he was trying to say. But yeah, we are living in those times. Yep, that's I'm about as far right wing as you can. Well, I mean, reasonably yet. I don't want to say
not anarchistic, but you're definitely pretty far right.
Yeah, exactly.
Conservative. Yeah. So, were you always that way, or is this something that developed in your studies, or?
Yeah, right. So, good question. So, it all started for me when I was a kid, and I remember, growing up, and Newt Gingrich was the Speaker of the House. And I thought he was, I looked at him as sort of being, I've heard about the Reagan era and all that, but I think with Newt, he was just this dynamic figure. I couldn't vote for him or anything, but I just looked at him because he was a historian and he had this dynamic personality and he was a great debater, and I had a lot of respect for him. So yeah, I've talked publicly about that before to several people, and I've mentioned at the seminars. I know I've mentioned it there too, and yeah, that was the beginning of it. And I grew up in a very conservative household, and just very well. My family went back during the I would say the golden age, during the greatest generation, when World War II era. They were FDR supporters, but they migrated, if you would, with their politics further right when we got into the 60s after the Kennedy era. And so, I kind of had that background, but my family was always blue collar and stuff, but still had these social conservative foundation, if you would, and that's how it all began. Just growing up in that house. But then for me personally, it was really, I just liked Newt. I agreed with his policies and everything, and I said, I'm going to be a Republican, and that's how that began. With that. So as far as my how that mates with, or I reconcile that with my education, it's the same question I had in a different way when I decided to take archaeology, because I was essentially becoming an anthropologist. And, my family's very religious, and it was, how do you reconcile your faith with scientific analysis? It's easy for me, actually. I don't really have a problem with that. That's probably, I don't know, that's a big topic, but.
I'd be very curious to hear, because people seem to think they can't coexist. And that's so bizarre to me, because when you look at, certainly the emergence of the scientific era, they very much coexisted, and people did not see them as being separate at all. So, yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, well, the thing is, really comes through, like all things in life. I feel that it's basically, any problems you're having is rooted in a misunderstanding or an ignorance. If you don't believe that, just spend some time with me on Twitter, which I know you do. Anyways, just spend some time with me on Twitter. Whenever you're getting trolled or something, it's usually just a lot of ignorance, a massive amount of it. And so, and it's there's only so much you can do, and how many times can you explain yourself or explain something in different ways, and somebody just, whether they want to understand it or accept it. And that's something that's how I one of my ways of approaching life. So when it comes to, like, when you're dealing with say the origins of let's like when you're talking about the age of the Earth, which is one of the biggest things. As an archaeologist, I'll sit here and I can discuss with you the fact that the last ice age ended 12,000 years ago, right? And but as a Christian, you have to sit here and you go, wait a minute, the Earth was created in 4004 BC. It doesn't actually say that in the Scripture. We come to those conclusions because we rely on the chronologies in the Scripture. We just string all the years together every time, and we add it up and we go, well, the Earth is 6,000 years old, approximately. Actually, creation is you go back to Adam. Adam and Eve, you can say that was roughly 6,000 years ago, if you're using the biblical chronology. But the Earth is much older than that, and that's the thing. The Bible doesn't actually say that the Earth was made 6,000 years ago. The words in Genesis 1:1 to Genesis 1:2, actually Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2. Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created the heavens, the earth. Genesis 1:2 is, and the earth became without a form and void, and darkness covered the earth. If you take the English and you go back into the original Hebrew, the phrase in Genesis 1:2 is actually a past tense verb, and it doesn't say and it was, it actually translates everywhere else in the Scripture, and it became formless and void, and darkness covered the earth. It changes the entire meaning. So, when you think about it from this perspective too. When God creates something, he creates it perfect. Why would he create something that's formless and void? So I already started getting into this when I was in college too, because of course all my professors are secular and top notch in their field. Fortunately, they were all very open and to debate and conversation. So when I was forced to take a certain amount of evolution and a lot of prehistory, which is prehistoric history, can go all the way back hundreds of thousands of years to the Paleolithic period, So I started actually just formulating my own theories, and I don't say it's my theories. There's actually some people know it's called gap theory. In Christianity or Christology, theology essentially. So if you go from Genesis 1:1 and 1:2, and if you believe there was a time. Something went on between the actual creation of the universe and then the Lord saying this, and that happened. That there was this gap of time that in time immemorial, we don't actually know how long it was. That's called gap theory. And yes, it's called gap theory. That's true, but it fits perfect. It explains a lot if you allow for that. It also makes God look a lot bigger to me, because then I start thinking, well, then there were other creations that went on, because then there are other scriptures that allude to it. You read in Ezekiel where Satan or Lucifer actually was walking in Eden, not the garden, in Eden itself, which is a regional place biblically. And so he's walking around and he's a prince over all these people. When the heck did that happen? It didn't happen at any time in the last 6,000 years. He was a serpent in the garden. And then the Lord says, I'm going to put the garden in the east of Eden. So you start going to yourself, okay, well, wait a minute, Eden was already here. They're just these subtle things that are very passive that indicate that there must have been something there was another time before our time as humans. And then you say, well, okay, well, what about all these bones they find and everything? To me, evolution's a joke. I mean, biological evolution is a joke. I always thought it was silly. If you listen to really any smart mathematician, I can't think of, and maybe you know him because I know how educated you are. But yeah, there was a mathematician a number of years ago that used to debate this issue. He's a secular Jew, and I thought it was brilliant the way he was much more articulate than me. Excuse me. I remember him talking about how the material record. There isn't much to it, first of all, as far as our ancient quote unquote ancestors. But you can't make anything of it. That's true. You really can't. You make a bunch of assumptions based on a few bits of bone, and you draw these conclusions that in some way we evolved. But the thing that gets me is the probability that something that is a fish, essentially, something very small, is going to evolve into a land-based creature as sophisticated and complex as we are. I mean, you might as well go out. You're talking about trillions to one that's going to happen. It's like taking a Volkswagen and trying to make it into a submarine. It's harder than that. So these mathematically, it's silly, it's stupid, it's preposterous. But most people in the scientific community won't say that, even though I believe a lot of them think that personally, because they're afraid. for being basically canceled out politically, if you want to use the modern expression, which is as an educator, I understand that. And so they keep their mouths shut. But the thing is, whenever I hear of consensus in the scientific community, that's a political term. Consensus is a political term. There's never consensus in science. It's always, that's evolving. Society evolves. The people's opinions evolve. But biologically, I mean, yeah, why, I'm going to just like be very layman about it. And I know a lot of people would totally relate with me on this. If evolution's true, why aren't we still witnessing it? It's in some degree, somewhere, someplace biologically. But that's the way. But it's just that coming in from this perspective, and yes, I'm a Christian and everything, but I was able to actually express myself and debate with students and with professors and reconcile. And I made my arguments, and that's where it's at, and I left it there. But at the same time, it's easy for me too, because it frees me up to saying, hey, once I start coming from this idea, and I say, because they label you right away. You're a Christian. The Earth's not 6,000 years old. And I go, you're right. I say to them, it's not, and they get confused. I said, have you ever read the Bible? Well, no, not really. Go read it. In fact, get it in Hebrew and start translating the words for yourself. That's the original language of the Old Testament. They get the Masoretic text. And and I give them the ISBN number to a good copy, and I say, here's some, get the Strong's Concordance and get some good thesauruses, and you're set to go, and you're an educator, and start doing your own homework on it, and tell me if you think that's what it really says in those verses, and I start handing them a bunch. And like I said, you can do this throughout the entire Old Testament. There's a lot of passive indicators in there that just suggest the Earth is much older, and people read over it. They just they do this, and you can get me into theology. That's a whole nother field of mine. I have my own opinions on that too, even in the New Testament and stuff. But I was able to reconcile it, and I have pastors in my family, and so we would sit down and I would debate church history with them, but we always come from the same fundamental background. Jesus Christ is Lord, and I never sacrifice that. And yet I'm an archaeologist. Yeah, it's kind of a weird paradox. So I'm sorry, I went on and on and on. I took over your show for a second.
That was awesome. That's why you're here.
I gotta remember, this is not my podcast. So yeah.
I appreciate it. I asked and I wanted the full answer. I'm very curious. Have you read, there was an article I saw, it was a couple of months ago, about how scientists had traced all human life back to one man and one woman.
Yeah, I have read that, and you know what? They actually, I didn't know.
I wonder what their names were.
Yeah, right, exactly. I remember. Well, here's another one for you. I don't know if you know this, but going back several years, there was, at least in biological evolution, excuse me, there was actually there is an Eve. So they do trace it back. There's out of Africa theory that we all go back to Africa in some way, and I don't subscribe to that theory. I think there's a lot of debate. There's a lot of archaeologists that don't. There's a lot that do. There's a lot of debate going back and forth on that. Of course, I believe the Fertile Crescent was the origin of civilization. It certainly was the origin of literate civilizations, historical civilizations, Mesopotamia specifically, the breadbasket of society. That was there's a debate raging. It doesn't rage really, but you can make an argument that who developed written languages first? Was it the Egyptians, or was it the Mesopotamians, Sumerians? And it was probably, it's hard to say, but between 400 to 3300 BC, somewhere around there, it was the earliest written languages. So when we say civilization, it's sort of like you're implying a literate civilization from a Western point or Western-centric point of view. But there are other civilizations that are older. And so, that's the way I look at it. But I digress. The thing is, there was who was the first mother, and they call her Eve. They actually did dub her Eve in evolutionary biology, and I mean we're talking, they go back, some million years, or some. I don't know if it was 1.5 million years or something like that. Again, that area of prehistory is not my forte, but they do this trace through DNA. So they trace it all the way back, and that's where they do a lot of it from.
Right.
Yeah.
I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah.
I'm also curious So I think you were talking about how, as an archaeologist, like a lot of your professors were secular. And I think we're seeing that trajectory very much so. There's a secularization, certainly in this country, but I think even throughout the West, we're seeing a lot of that. How do you think that has impacted the political and sociocultural climate?
You mean as far as the professors being secular, how did that impact them?
Not just professors, but in general, I think that we're seeing a secularization. I don't think it's just in academia, but I think certainly, I guess I could ask you twofold. What do you think about it in academia, and how do you feel about it throughout our culture?
Well, I think in academia, it's a crime. That was largely caused by the way, and I'll just give you a cause in effect. That was largely caused by conservatives, specifically, I would say Christians, whether they were Catholic or Protestant, ceding that ground over decades, academia to people on the far left, and that's been going on for a century. You can go back as early as the early 1900s, the early 20th century. When public education was starting to really become prolific, the early academic leaders, a lot of them were the ones that were pioneers, quote unquote, were liberals. They were, by our standards, they would probably be more conservative, but by their standards, they were pretty secular and pretty liberal. And I think it's a terrible thing, because the children, especially in public education, which reaches far more children than private education, it had a negative impact. I'm not saying that in of itself, if you had a liberal education in some way, you're going to automatically become a liberal or a registered Democrat. And we've already seen in our lifetimes, right, that as people get older, they tend to move further to the right. Donald Trump, for instance, getting most of the votes.
Oh, what did Churchill say? If you're under 30 and you're on the left, then if you're under 30 and you're on the right, then you have no heart, and if you're over 30 and you're on the left, then you have no brain.
That's right. And there's more proof about how he was, again, a person who was a student of history, and yes, he understood that from observations and from knowing history. You get more conservative as you mellow, as you get older. You're supposed to. Some people get more liberal. Those are actually the anomalies. Those are the exceptions to the rule, but that happens too. But I think it's been a terrible thing, and it has a terrible impact. It forces us to actually have to re-educate people, and it's some, but at the same time, I think, though, for me, it getting hit by a lot of people who did think differently than me expanded my opinions of things, like I was saying at the seminar that you attended over the last week. The fact is that post-structuralism and structuralism and all these different philosophical points, which I know you also very familiar with, these different modern philosophies. I'm happy that I got to go through archaeological theory, that I took social theory, that I studied some sociology, because I even though it's secular, it's very humanistic. It helped explain, in the natural at least, things to me, so I was able to put them in perspective, and I actually could understand the other side's thinking. Of course, one of the most obvious ones is the fact, and I do consider myself more post-structuralist. I didn't even say that the other night in the seminar, I know, but I do consider myself as an archaeologist more post-structural position, which, I take the position of, like, it's up to the perspective of the individual, because, as I say all the time, everything is subjective, nothing is objective, and I tell my students that sometimes, and it throws people off. Now, I as a Christian, I believe there are absolutes. But if we're talking about humans, if we're talking about human knowledge, it's very subjective. I'm not talking about spiritual knowledge.
So this is very interesting, because Nietzsche actually said this as well. He said that everything is open to interpretation, and people think that he was a forerunner for postmodernism because he said that, which couldn't be further from the truth, because nowhere does he ever deny that there are absolute truths. He absolutely believes that there are. That doesn't mean that human beings are always capable of knowing the absolute truth.
No, it doesn't. That's because we're finite creatures trying to understand the infinite. And so Right. So that, I just sit back and so if I'm speaking with, and again, being a human, I believe we have spirits and souls, which I do differentiate. I do believe these are two different aspects of our characters and our beings, but we're living in a physical world. And so, we're interrelating with other physical beings. And so, unless Jesus himself physically is walking amongst us, which he did 2,000 years ago. Beyond that, or the early apostles who were all anointed by him. Beyond that, you're dealing with other humans who are subjective, finite, and therefore you can't possibly know everything. You can't possibly. We're not omnipotent. We're not omniscient. We're not, and so people are we make mistakes, right? That's common sense. And so therefore, when you're touching knowledge, I just believe people are, inherently subjective. So yeah, it doesn't mean that you're wrong. I'm wrong. You're wrong. We could be right on that thing, but it is open for interpretation. You can't ever be 1,000% certain. The only thing I could say, some people I knew once say, I remember I used to grow up in I grew up in a household where there was all different generations, right? It's a very Latin household. So I remember the old timers would say to me, only two things are definite in life: death and taxes. So that's the only absolute you can't avoid taxes while you're living. You're definitely going to die. So that's all you can. But you actually can't avoid taxes if you don't work, and But then that's
a lot of that. I would say probably the only two things that are inescapable are suffering and death. That would be. That's
a better way. That's very good. That's very good. And you can, that's a good way of looking at it. To circle back, I'm going to use the word circle back because that's the popular, trendy word right now, right? To get back to that other point, you mean when you said, we're talking to me, I think you were saying about beyond academia, you're saying larger society has secularism and human. Yeah, oh, definitely. One of my biggest things is I'm a declinist, so I tend to look at that's just my term, by the way. I honestly don't know if people call themselves that, but I think things are in decline inherently. So while I'm very positive and upbeat, and I project that to a lot of people because that's who I am. I also am very much. I believe that society, especially Western civilization, is declining. So. Euro America is sort of slowly in decline, and history shows that. So one of the things that I think has hastened it or contributed to it heavily is the fact that we have moved away, broadly speaking, not universally, but broadly speaking, in society, especially with the major institutions, from our Judeo-Christian heritage, which I know has been talked about since before I was born, right? They were saying that this was going on and that we were becoming more liberal. Really, if you go back all the way back to the 60s, you can, people were saying that, and in one degree or another. And I'm certain you can go back 100 years and hear people talking about, things are getting bad. But we are. I think that in the past, there was more reverence for the church and the church's positions. I think there was families were more intact. Of course, the family unit is disintegrating, which is a huge contributor to our social problems and our economic problems, actually, too. Yep. And all of that is like, and then you can trace it all the way back to the fact that people are abandoning their Judeo-Christian heritage, which isn't surprising when you consider you could see it. You just look at Hollywood. Hollywood's sort of like a reflection, right? They tend to say they're the reflection of what society's like. They're actually accurate in that. I think that if you look at Hollywood from the 30s and the 40s, and then you compare it to the 50s and the 60s, and compare that to the 70s and the 80s, and then to what's going on today, and you can see it just a steady decline. Right. And in society from one generation to another. And people, when you go back and you say, okay, well, what happened? Well, what happened was people, pretty much you remove God and you remove Christianity for public schools. You remove them from the workplace. You basically make it a crime virtually to speak publicly about your faith. Evangelicals and traditional Catholics want to go out and they want to talk about their faith, even Orthodox Jews, and they're either shut down, their churches are now closed. Just the attack is unreal. You can see video. I don't know if you've seen it in New York of police officers going to Orthodox Jewish homes when they're having Havdalah services, which take place after the Sabbath. And so, all of this is going on, and it's almost like, what the heck's going? Why are these religious fundamentalist groups from these different great religions monotheistic religions being targeted. That is where we've come to. The next thing that's going to happen is they're going to find ways of charging you with crimes. And I think we're starting to see indications of, this may sound paranoid and it's not meant to be, because everybody who knows me knows I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I hate conspiracy theories, right? I avoided them I just don't agree with them. And I won't even talk about them even casually. But I have a lot of people that, they're big believers in certain right-wing conspiracy theories, and I've never been. But it's what's going on in Silicon Valley, and I've talked about this a lot. I know with the censorship is a first step in that direction, to where basically if they can't put you in jail, they're going to shut you down and turn off your microphones and silence you, and they're not going to let you have a venue to speak publicly. And they control the public venue, which is the open conversational forums, which are online. These are either whether it's Twitter, whether it's YouTube, whatever. They're controlling it, and that's what we use that's a public forum today. That's where in ancient times you used to go in Greece, you'd go to the agora and you would speak publicly. In Rome, you go to the forum and you would speak publicly. Today we use online. We're doing what we do here on these social media sites. So but yeah, it's definitely Christianity. The decline of when people lose their religion, they lose a huge part of their identity, and then they don't know who they are anymore. And they need that kind of stability in society. Even if you weren't a church-going Christian, or you didn't go to your mosque, or you didn't go to your synagogue every Sabbath, still, you subscribe to some universal basic truths. The 10 Commandments being up on the wall, people would just subscribe to that.
Yep.
And that's why they
believe in something greater than yourself.
Absolutely.
All human beings need that. Yeah.
Yep. Absolutely.
Interesting.
Again, I'm monopolizing your podcast, and I'm going out becoming a lecturer.
Not at all. I asked you a question. You're giving me very thorough answers, which I greatly appreciate. I would absolutely agree. I think that, from my perspective, it's not just the, decline of certainly the identity and yes, the family structure. I think there's also, the core values that, our founding fathers certainly, and this, like I said, it extends to the West. I think when you talk about America, there are certain unique aspects, and then there's obviously we drew so much from Western civilization as a whole, but we are the only nation that is, one nation, indivisible under God. So I think that our founding fathers recognize that when you're talking about understanding that we're humans, we're limited, and you talked about your liberal arts education essentially, and how much you appreciated that. I think because it gave you a sense of humanity and that it is relevant. And I think it absolutely is. One of the things that I find so brilliant about our founding fathers was the fact that they really understood human nature. And it's one of the things that I see, and I'll circle back to use that phrase again. But I think that, they really understood human nature. And I think it's one of the big differences between the left and the right is that, the right typically understands that human nature is inherently flawed, but that, they're also very good and they're capable of tremendous good. And so they want to structure a society that recognizes there's evil within each of us. And how do we protect the society as a whole, from the problems that arise from that? But it's not that we're going to fix human beings. Whereas I think the left typically looks at the job of government or, societal structures to fix humanity. And I think that is kind of a fundamental worldview difference. But so with that, as a foundation for what I'm going to say next, I think that our founding fathers really understood humanity. And so they really did understand that human beings we all have darkness within each of us. And that in order for a free society, and that's what they valued, these were people who really had everything and were willing to risk it all because liberty meant more to them. And they knew that even in a free society where you have liberties, that it only worked if you had the checks and balances of a moral foundation. And that's why the Judeo-Christian values were woven into the fabric of our founding documents. And I think the fact that we, they very much stressed the, it's freedom of and from religion. So you didn't have to believe, and you could choose to believe in whatever you wanted to believe, but it was really important that moral foundation was there as a checks and balances to, some of the deadly sins that we all have a tendency towards if tempted enough, and had enough freedom
Yeah, and the founder, there was some universal, you're absolutely right, there were some universal truths that they applied. I mean, you think about it, Thomas Jefferson was a true deist. He basically, people say he wrote his own Bible. He cut it down and eliminated the miracles and a lot of the spiritual aspects to some moral basic truths. I mean, of course, I wouldn't do that, and I wouldn't recommend doing that. But yeah, he was a different person. He was much more liberal. I know I've talked about this again in my seminars, and but when you compare him to somebody like John Adams, who was by our standards, he would have been considered more of almost like an evangelical Christian. He was a fundamentalist, and these two were, these major pillars of the American Revolution and the founding of our nation. They're two of the greatest founding fathers. I think John Adams is often overlooked because he was a one-term president, and there was controversy. It's funny, people don't even know this. There's a lot of controversy to his election and his re-election because of the election of 1796 and 1800. But and a lot of people don't know also that Jefferson was his vice president, which is hilarious. That's sort of like having Trump be the vice president to Biden, I guess, in many ways. But it's like these are the founders had different. They had diversity there. I think there were. I don't know if I can't even remember now if there was. Do you remember if it was 55 or 57 members to the Continental Congress? I don't remember exactly the number, but I think there was, all of them were Protestant except for 3 that were Catholic. 3 or 4 of them were Catholic, and then you had the deists. But they had these like you said, they had universal truths and values that they subscribed to, which anchors a civilization. And what happens is eventually, as Will Durant wrote extensively on, and I highly recommend anyone that listens to your broadcast, I always say this to students. I say this to adults, any age bracket of student I have. Read The Story of Civilization. It's a tremendous set of books by Will Durant. It's a little dated by our times because he wrote it in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. But he talks a lot about how what is this famous quote? A great civilization isn't conquered from without until it's destroyed itself from within. So, what does that tell us about it? What is it specifically? People's morals, their mores, actually, their values, they are abandoned. In the case of Rome, this is when he wrote that quote that in the epilogue of Caesar and Christ, he was referencing Rome, but you can apply it to a number of civilizations. I think Mel Gibson used it at the opening of his movie, his Apocalypto in 2006, which had to do with the Maya civilization. And in the case of that movie, it was dealing with the post-classical Maya civilization from the Yucatan Peninsula. That's specifically the setting of the movie, but the Maya civilization was already in decline. And so, and by the way, and I always love to tell people this and tell students this, that there are Maya living today. There's a few million of them actually living, modern Maya that actually live in Guatemala, and in the surrounding areas. But they these people, these different civilizations, again, had a moral compass, and when they abandoned that compass, they literally got lost. And the United States is no different. When I say the United States, it's because we're the largest, right? We're the most powerful. We're the last superpower on Earth. And we sort of bookend the last 2,000 years of history, first to Rome, and then you can just trace it all the way up to the United States, which is the pinnacle. Really, Western civilization is the peak of human history, for when it comes to this I should say, this generation of Western civilization, this period of time we're living in, if you want to say Anglo-America or Euro-America, is the peak of human development. And I'm not saying this to put down other parts of the world, but it's because of the age of exploration, because of the conquest, frankly, if we're being frank about it, because of the way we exported, whether it was our religions, we exported our languages, everything from Spanish to English, to even Portuguese because of the customs, and a lot of it, a lot of those things we exported, whether it was mostly through Great Britain and Spain and Portugal, but also other countries. A lot of them have their roots in classical education, or I can say classical education, but the classical arts in the classical world. And so, in a sense, Greco-Roman history has, because of the Renaissance and whatnot, has been then disseminated through these European powers over the last 500 years. And it's been disseminated to all these different parts of the world. And so you have, whether, if you can go, whether you go from China all the way to the Middle East, you can see the stamp of Europe and America on all these different civilizations, all these different cultures. And so, but again, I say Western civilization is in decline, primarily because the United States, before it, Great Britain, we are slowly, whether it's economically, socially, whether it's politically, we are slowly on a trajectory downwards. And we get these resurgences, we have these revivals, if you would, whether it's the Reagan era, whether it's the Trump era. If you go back further, you could say it was the Nixon period. When Nixon won in 72, everyone thought it was like, this was unbelievable, because he won in 68, and he was going to promise to get us out of Vietnam. And in 72, the massive landslide he won by 49 states, it's rivaled only by Ronald Reagan's reelection in 84. I mean, no one could have foreseen within 2.5 years he would be resigning from office. So, but there are these periods, that was a repudiation, his Law and Order campaign in 72, of the far left and the entire leftist free speech movement out of the that was making a home for itself in the Democratic Party, the anti-war movement particularly, and the riots and everything that was going on. So, but we go through these periods of revival, and we're slowly, though, the trajectory, in my opinion, is downward. The problem is, after, like I pointed out at the seminar again, after the United States, what comes next? There is no other Western power. The Great Britain Great Britain declined, and we took over their mantle, as the world policeman.
So I have two questions. Go
ahead.
I had one before, and then you
go ahead. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I went on and on and on.
No, don't be sorry at all. So my first question is, so looking throughout history, and because you say that we are in a decline, which it does seem that is certainly a possibility.
Yeah.
So what could we learn from other fallen civilizations, and how could we do, or do you think that we could possibly slow the decline, or if there's any hope to reverse the decline? So that's my first question. And then my second question is, so it'll be two-part, and then I'll let you just talk and chat about it. The second question would be, because I happen to agree. I think, we are the last frontier. I think that we are the helm for the free will of humanity. And, when we go, the rest of the world goes. So what does that mean for the world, and certainly the free world, and for humanity as a whole?
Well, I'll answer your second question first. I'll say, when we go, I don't know. We have been there as again, when I often talk about Western civilization. Again, this is my area where I spent. It's the part of history I love the most, which is kind of funny, because then, of course, I have an affinity and a great love for Asian history, and specifically Korean and Japanese history, and actually Chinese history too. But I mean, I would say, probably, if I have to say expertise, and I put that in quotes because I'm not an expert in it, but if I like medieval and Edo period Japan, but and we're talking about great civilizations like Mesoamerica. We're talking about pre-Columbian Western Hemisphere, if you would, the pre-Columbian Americas. We're talking about the Aztecs and the Maya, which were outstanding civilizations, definitely rival Rome. The Inca absolutely could in South America could rival Rome. Think about it. Here's a civilization that had no written language. By our standards, they were prehistorical in a sense, yet they had a sophisticated highway system, and they could transport goods over long distances of we're talking hundreds of miles within days. So this is a very, these are very, and they had a tremendous, all of these cultures had outstanding masonry and building and architectural engineering skills beyond beyond how I think about it. It's like people go, how did they build the pyramids without bulldozers or without modern machinery? Well, I say, go. How did the Inca do what they did without iron tools, without metal tools? I mean, you have to start asking yourself these questions. These were very advanced people. They certainly, but when you think about, because of whatever the reasons were, and it's largely because of conquest, right? And there's no getting around it. The European civilizations, the European cultures, the countries, they bear the responsibility of having conquered a lot of different parts of the world, and therefore, but when that happens, they inadvertently or deliberately export their culture and put their cultural fingerprint on another civilization.
Sure.
And that needs to be studied, and that needs to be discussed in every serious history class and archaeological class, in my opinion. But I think when we go, I mean, there is the closest parallel to that I can say would probably be, I would say, Rome, the Western Roman Empire falling specifically. And it did fall. I disagree with some of the more modern historians. I know they're great people and they dominate the field, but some of them believe that, Rome did not really fall in the West on a particular date. It kind of the culture continued. And I said, but the Senate wasn't really operating anymore, and there was no more emperors, and the Germanic tribes that were the Goths that were actually occupying the Ostrogoths that were occupying Italy, and they set up a monarchy. This wasn't the Roman Empire, quote unquote, anymore. It was something other, and so that's there's a little iffy there when you do that. But there was still Roman culture continuing. But that's about what happened in the rest of Western Europe. Over the fifth, actually throughout the 5th, 6th, 7th century, Western Europe pretty much just fell into, and they don't like using the expression anymore, but to paraphrase Biden, the Dark Ages. A Dark Ages is what fell on them. For a lot of reasons you call it that, primarily because there was no universal lingua franca that was unifying the continent anymore, which was Latin. Latin was only learned now by priests. It was where it was maintained. Mm-hmm. If you were wealthy and you were a nobleman, you could afford to have your child educated. Mm-hmm. Illiteracy went through the roof. There were so many different dialects of Germanic tongues that were being spoken all over Western Europe. The highway system fell into disrepair and disuse. I mean, this was a bad time. The aqueducts, which were bringing in fresh water all over the empire, were suddenly no longer being used. I mean, essentially, if you were an Italian in the 7th century living in Italy, you were looking up at these architectural wonders. If you were in Rome, wondering who were these people that built these things? How did they manage to get the finances and the manpower to put this together? What is the Colosseum even used for? They didn't even have a knowledge of it in many cases. So this was decline. And then, of course, there was an increase in pestilence. There was an increase in plagues. I'm using the old-fashioned terms. The sewage system was a critical part that was no longer being. Not every Roman city had these things, mind you, but a lot of them did. And so, with that came increased disease and sickness. And then, of course, there wasn't the birth rate dropped off precipitously. That's for a variety of reasons. A lot of times there was a lot more stillborn births, but like in any civilization, any part of the world, anytime you're living, if there's not enough medicine and doctors and nutrition rates are low, you possibly are going to have infant mortality. So there's a lot of that. And then, of course, that's going to contribute to what? Well, then the adults, when they don't grow up to be adults, they can't work on farms. And again, the most people could do is actually farm for themselves. So in Rome, the height of the empire, the major Roman cities were actually importing grain and food from different parts of the empire. All of that was stopped. I mean, the breadbasket of like Egypt, where they had a lot of grain brought, all of that stopped. And so Western Europe pretty much was just the population just decreased, and people were living just to and barely try. In some cases, not in every case, it's hit or miss depending on where you're at. But they were just trying to survive their life. And it wasn't, this was a really bleak time in many ways. There were a lot of positives too. When you get to like for instance, 800, you get to the period of Charlemagne and this resurgence and basically a renaissance of Roman culture in a German kingdom. But there are these. So there's this back and forth that goes on. And so if you ask me what happens when if and I don't believe it's going to happen in our lifetime. But I'll actually come back to that in a moment. First, I'll say, if you can ask me what's going to happen after the United States is not here, if the United States is not here, I would say to you that it would likely we would fall into a neo-dark age, a neo-medieval period. I mean, and then that's what it would amount to. Think about, and if people want to get a good view of how I view it, and it's again, I like to do this. I always use movies in my classes. Mm-hmm. I reference them. I would say, I wouldn't say Mad Max. I think that's kind of like way out there, but you could say a little bit like Mad Max, but a good movie that's underrated in my opinion, but it's kind of long. I can see why some people didn't like it, is The Postman with Kevin Costner. I think that actually
great movie.
Yeah, it is a great movie, right? It's a good post-apocalyptic movie. Yeah. It gives you a feeling of like, what if the United States just disintegrated? Not really a war where, like you see in Mad Max, it's a post-apocalyptic world in the sense that there's been a major nuclear conflict and people are just trying to survive, but a little more like something we could relate with. Like a catastrophe happened, there's no centralized government, and essentially forget about the states, the cities and the communities just boarded themselves up, build walls, and they're acting like it's the 1800s and they're living on the frontier again in the American West. And that's how it is, like a neo-Old West movie. And that's the setting. And I think that is more, unless there is a major war or something, that's kind of I see where things could, you're talking about now social degradation, so that's going to inevitably lead to a collapse in the political structure, and that's what you have.
I think we're already seeing that,
yes, we are.
Yeah.
And what was the
other question is there any, and then I now have another one, but before I get to my second question, what are things that, looking through history, are there things that we can learn from those fallen civilizations and try and either slow down this decline or reverse it possibly?
Yeah, I would say the first thing is I would tell people to kind of have a come to Jesus moment, and you have to look, spiritual revivals, and this is again heck, Protestant Reformation history. You don't even have to qualify it with Protestant, because there was the Reformation and there was the Counter-Reformation from the Catholic Church, and all of this has to be studied. This isn't even taught in most schools anymore. Mm-hmm. So when I've taught at some really top classical schools, and I can't believe when parents sending these kids with these tuitions, and I've told we're talking about older students now. I'm not talking about fifth graders or something, and they still don't understand or have a knowledge about it. And that's scary. And I've had students that, now we're talking about college students. Okay. We're talking about that, they're getting these educations, and I hate to say I don't want to say it's the teacher's fault or the school's fault only, and I think that they largely to blame. I think sometimes the curriculums are boring, but I'm going to tell you some of these. We have a whole group of young people coming up that are somewhat younger. Of course, they're younger than me, and they have no interest. And they have an a lot of them have an entitlement mentality. And they're not necessarily left-wingers. They could be from right-wing families, and very few of them have an interest. Some of them do. Some of them have how would I put it? They have a large appetite, and for knowledge, but a lot of them don't. And I don't know if that's. I want to say that's every generation has that to some degree, but I just feel like it's getting worse. I think they have they just have like this instant gratification. So they want to be on their phones all the time. They want to be they figure, I don't need to know that. I can look it up online. But that doesn't make them scholars, and they don't even have a clue what scholarship is. And so, if we look at it like, what are we going to do? What can we do about this? Well, I think if we look at and I did digress a bit, but if we look at the fact that we need a come to Jesus moment. We need this revival in society. Revivals took place throughout the 19th century in the United States. They took place throughout especially the first half of the 20th century, all the way down to the Billy Graham revivals and into the Oral Roberts and all of them. And this was all going. Something happened in the 50s and 60s, and people started. There wasn't any movement of the church. The church has been kind of bland, and we have this, in my opinion, and I don't want to become too churchy here with your audience, but we have this thing where we have these mega churches and whatnot. I don't know. This is just me, but I don't know if these pastors, they may have 40 or 50,000 people that attend their church. If you have that many people that are really into scripture and they're really, you should have great debates and conversations about doctrine, and that should be what's permeating public discourse, because you see, when you have that many people that are conversational, if you would, on biblical truths, and they're debating, which you should have robust debates on these topics. The disciples had
learn how to think instead of what to think.
Exactly. And then you won't have, it'll have a positive impact, in my opinion, on the larger secular society. It just does. If you don't believe that, look at Hollywood in the 30s. In 34, they passed the Hays Code. Well, the Hays Code was just their way of censoring themselves, because they didn't want to run afoul of the church. When I say the church now, I'm speaking broadly. I'm not talking about any specific church, Catholic, Protestant, whatever. It doesn't matter. It's just larger Christian movement. They didn't want to run afoul of it. Mm-hmm. They knew that their opinion, what Christians thought about their movies, was going to impact their budget, and so they didn't want to get anyone angry. So they kept a tight leash on all these actors and the films that they produced. They made sure that they actually censored them. They self-censored, and then you think of that, and then you think about what happens from 67, 68 forward. And when they abandoned the Hays Code and they put the rating system in, and then, but again, Hollywood abandoned that because society became more liberal and abandoned its Christian roots. I would say to people, they should pray for a revival. That's one thing. If they don't, and I often like to tweet about, I did this a lot during the election. If you pray, and if you don't, maybe you should start. I tell people that, but here's another thing too. I would say to you, another thing I would say is we have to get back to serious classical education. When I say classical too, is I'm not just talking about sitting around talking about Aristotle and Plato all day. That's not necessarily what I mean. But I
think that would be a great start.
It would be a great start. I do. Just if you can imagine young people debating those topics, they're not going to have time to sit around and they wouldn't care what Beyonce says, or they wouldn't care what, who the Kardashians, they just wouldn't have time for any of that. Can you imagine if young people were I know they like to do their little chat rooms and whatnot, if they were sitting around chatting about, the meaning of life, basically, and the better way to live. And,
if they actually had a foundation in Aristotle, they would have a foundation in how to live and how to think about difficult questions and difficult issues. And that's really what those ancient philosophers talked about. So it would be really
it's true. And the fact is this, people don't necessarily appreciate the importance of classical education in the way people, in their thinking, and they tend to think, well, classical education is something that is stuffed shirt, and it's this or that. It's not. It's something that can be very, I think it can be very relatable to young people, and it can be very relatable. That's how I teach. So that's how I teach when I teach, though, because I teach very broadly and I go into different areas and I blend it in and I try to make it relevant to people today. That's just my thing. But yeah, go ahead. I'm trying to get better at this because we're going back. I want to go back and forth with you. I don't want to keep dominating.
I love it. I greatly appreciate it. So no, you're fine. My other question, which was when we were talking before about that, like post-apocalyptic, the decline of the United States. What do you think, moving kind of in the more near future, do you think is going to happen? I know there's been some, so let me preface it this way. Yeah. I do believe, so I'd like to know whether you believe that we are experiencing kind of somewhat of a color revolution. So maybe the alternative way of putting putting that could be, an ideological subversion from within. So there's been talks of that's a very hard thing to come back from. So, when I talk about where we need to go, I don't say to make, I say like restoring America is really what I think needs to happen, because we feel that is where we're at. And I know
I just want to say Kevin Costner. That was with the Restored United States of America in the Postman. That was the name of the that was what it was all about, rebuilding the United States. But go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's very much where we are right now. We need a restoration, but I'm curious. I guess again, we'll give you a twofold question. What do you think we can do to restore America now, to come back from that? So 3 parts. Sorry, I lied.
That's right.
The first one is, do you think that we are experiencing some sort of a color revolution or have experienced it? 2, how can we come back from that? And then 3, do you think some sort of war is in our future, whether that be globally or civil?
I think that, with regards to the first part of your question, I think that there's some version that goes on to a certain extent. Because clearly with the media is now, you don't have, for the most part, and we're talking about CNN, MSNBC, all that. These are not right. The MSN, right? We're talking about the fake news. We're talking about people that are activists. These journalists are all activists now. I was dumbstruck watching a '90s movie the other night, and I'm sitting there and I can't believe Bernard Shaw from CNN was in it, and they got him to do this little part. I remember him. I thought he was a pretty straightforward reporter. They were just reporting on the news back then, even though they had a liberal bent. Most of these guys, they live in New York, so what are you going to do? They're going to have a liberal bent.
Well, we're also human. We can't involve ourselves in some sort of bias. We're going to follow.
Absolutely, but you didn't have an Acosta, right? Is it his name Acosta? I can't even. Jim Acosta, right? I mean, you can tell. I don't pay much attention. I don't follow many people, so that's the funny thing about me. I follow who I like, and they're usually small counts, and I don't even pay any attention to what these big guys do. But but I know he's an activist. I've seen him confront the president and other people. These are activists. These aren't serious journalists. And so I think with regards to subverting the truth, absolutely. When you saw Silicon Valley jump on board because they understood from 4 years ago, or now 5 years ago, the role they played in helping Donald Trump have a platform outside of the media. He was able to reach all his people. So they were planning this for years to subvert the truth, right? To actually censor the media. The biggest thing from last year was, besides the fraud in the election, was the cover-up of the Hunter Biden story, which was clearly a coordinated effort and that predicated what was going to come next, which was this literally covering up for the fraud and then shutting down the president. But whether they're actually themselves, whether there's a cabal and whether there's this joint effort, frankly, I look at Biden and I look at the rest of them and I think they're partly shocked that they managed to do this. I think when you think about the fact that a year ago at this time, on March 9th, 2000, and that's when we were recording this on March 9th, but on March 9th, 2020, Donald Trump wasn't going to be president. I don't think really many people that were seriously, whether they were right or left, thinking if they would actually say there was no chance he was going to get reelected or Biden was going to be president. No one would believe that in a heartbeat. So I think COVID, of course, is the culprit in all of this. I don't believe COVID was something that I don't think COVID was something that was not made in a laboratory. I think that it may have been something that they modified, and that's my opinion. But I'm not. The point is, it was exported and imported by the major Western powers and pretty much the whole world, and it infected us. So I think that played in. But I don't, as far as a grand plan, if we go back a year and a half ago, I don't think there was any real plan. So I have this, I'm sort of nuanced, and my jury, as far as me, the jury's out. I don't really know whether or not I can really subscribe to that. I do now. I'm sorry. What was the second part to your question? So I can't remember.
We're experiencing an ideological subversion, and then if we are, then is there a way that we can come back from that to back. Yeah, because an ideological subversion is basically a communist takeover.
Yeah,
right. They do it without firing. They do it through the culture and through the ideology and through like the media, all these different institutions, which have been, infiltrated for, as we were saying, it's been over 100 years. We certainly saw the Institute for Social Research in 1923 at Columbia University, and then they worked their way through, the rest of the universities and through Hollywood and.
I think world socialism was always going to be achieved peaceably. I mean, this idea of a worldwide revolution, which pretty much Karl Marx envisioned for different cultures, right, in different societies. I mean, the fact is that it was first successful, quote unquote, successful, at least in accomplishing its goal in third world countries. It's becoming more post Cold War world, it's become more successful in the industrial world, largely because the Soviet Union's not there. Now, I think when you look at what's going on first in academia, of course, we have most of the liberals and most of the claptrap that you deal with. I mean, a lot of these teachers and professors, if they're liberals, they tend to subscribe to some sort of left-wing socialist or cultural Marxist views, which is, and they think that that's again because they never experienced living in a communist country. They're too young to remember the Cold War, the Red Scare, and all that. And I say the Red Scare is, I mean, afraid the nuclear war was going to happen. We were building these weapons, and I'm not talking about the Red Scare of the 50s under McCarthy, but now. I would think that, I'd say that certainly there's probably some infiltration. I think there's generally probably a lot of infiltration, at least, again, academia in Hollywood, the major entertainment industries, Silicon Valley, which is kind of odd. Again, these powerful people who made their money through hypercapitalism subscribe to left-wing socialist economic policies for some reason. I think it's largely, though, it's elitism. Well, that's elitism. They want to maintain control.
It's elitism, but it's also globalism. So these corporations have global interests. And, if you're familiar with Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto. So Karl Marx is interesting because, he wrote the Communist Manifesto and then he wrote Das Kapital. He actually denounced Communist Manifesto and then wrote Das Kapital as his very, in my opinion, feeble attempt at economic theory. But in the Communist Manifesto, he asserted that in order for communism to be successful, it had to be global. There could be no free nation, free entity, free market if communism was
because it would draw people away from it. So
it had to be global. And so these globalists, there's slight nuances, just like, fascism and communism, they have nuances, but they're both totalitarian in nature. And the same thing with globalism and communism. So these people who are these big corporations, that's why we're seeing the rise of the corporate state, and that is a global entity. So.
Yeah, and if they actually get their political way, of course, eventually all of society or societies will be basically living on a government-run plantation and will be subservient to them. It's basically a return to serfdom. It's a neo-feudalism, if you would even. You'll be tied to the land and you'll be dependent on them forever. Well, for instance, I mean, the war against owning your own home or just owning stuff outright. That decline in home ownership over the last decade. Something that we used to be part of the American dream, right? It's becoming increasingly difficult, and there's a less and less desire for people to do it. So everything's rented and dependent, whether it's from your telecommunications to your own living quarters, on someone else who could take it away just like that. And people aren't saving anymore. People aren't and those that do save we worry the stock market is going to go down. It's going to wipe out their 401ks. So there's a lot of concern. The thing is that yes, there is, and who's going to survive this? Well, the people that'll survive it is the oligarchy. So that's going to be the elites, right? The corporate elites, as you put it, and the ones that'll be in charge, and they'll become the new Politburo. So they'll be the ones in charge. I mean, the proletariat never really runs anything, right? In a communist society, it's the people never really they never have any rights. They're just moved around and told where to go and how much to make and how much work to do and all that kind of stuff. So there's no freedom. There's a lack of freedom. And then what was the? I'm sorry, I'm going to ask you. What was the last part of your question? Do we remember anymore? What do we do about it? Is that what you're asking me?
What do we do about it? And then the last part was, do you think that there is the potential for any type of kinetic war? Because if you ask me, I guess I'll ask you. If you were to ask me, I think that we've already experienced certain types of warfare. But in terms of, do you think that there's any kinetic kind of a warfare in our future, globally or civilly?
Yeah. What we can do about it, first of all, again, fight back with, I think parents and conservatives in general have to get, and we're talking on the local level, have to get involved first in their, twofold. I would say I would take a two-pronged approach to this. I would say on the one hand, you've got to get involved in your kids' education or in young people's education, get involved in the school district, even if you don't have, right, a child in school. I mean, get involved in the local community education. Because conservatives, if we're not showing up at these conferences, if we're not making our voices heard, it's probably at best it's some left-wing family that's going to have undue influence on that school board. Make sure you vote on those local issues as well, specifically for school boards. Usually those are elected offices. Make sure you find out if that person is a conservative. If they're not, run for the office yourself. I mean, if you think about it, the founders a lot of them were farmers. So they weren't necessarily all like Thomas Jefferson, these polymaths, these brilliant people that had multiple fields of expertise. John Adams was a simple farmer. Samuel Adams, I think, was a farmer too. He also made good.
George Washington was a farmer.
Yeah, that's right. George Washington was a farmer, right? By the way, I was kidding about Sam Adams. In case somebody picked that up, I was kidding. Sam Adams didn't make beer, but anyway.
Sam Adams. Yeah, sorry, I missed that.
No, it was but yeah, George Washington was a farmer. In fact, he was the wealthiest president in American history until a certain man by the name of Donald Trump became president. But a lot of people don't know that, but anyways, by the way, do you know who the quote unquote the poorest? I hate the lack of a better word. President was in American history. Do you know offhand? Come on.
The what? Say that again.
Who was the poorest? The president who had the least amount of money. It was Harry Truman. Really? Truman. Yeah, it was Harry Truman. Yeah. And so, anyways, the thing is, I mean, I would say get involved. Then I would say this segues into the next part of my answer, and that is the fact that I would say get involved in your local politics in general. I mean, you definitely want.
Politics is local, right?
That's right. I mean, communists were famous for saying that at times. I've heard socialists say that, and it's true. What is it? Think globally, act locally. That's a famous socialist
slogan. They're really good at saying things that they know work to their advantage.
Absolutely. And they're right. We have to be just as aggressive as they are. Look, they just took over the leadership roles in the Nevada Democrat Party. They're being open. They're socialist Democrats. I hope the Democratic Party nationally, the DNC, just renames itself the Socialist Democrat Party of America. It would be great if they did it. It would create a dichotomy.
One thing I do appreciate is they have been more transparent as of recent, but I wish they would be fully transparent. Like Saul Alinsky talks a lot about like all of the rules for radicals, and they rename everything and they usurp language, and they do it. You saw it in Nazi Germany. It's a way of brainwashing, because if words have no meaning, then that's a way of destabilizing the civilization. And society. So I wish they would be more transparent, because if people want socialism, then they should be transparent that that's what they want, and that's what they're campaigning on, but not to hide under a cloak of something else that they think is going to appeal to a wider audience.
Yeah, well, and Marxism, I would say communism, socialism in general, just appeals to people's nature, because everybody's greedy, whether you're poor, whether you're wealthy, everybody wants more. They want whatever they don't have. They want what somebody else has, and so it's easily seductive, and that's what it really appeals to. And it preys on people that are ignorant, and those that are indoctrinated. Yeah,
I would just say that I think in theory it's really appealing. It's just that in practice it doesn't work that way, because Marxism is based on a utopia. Utopia literally means nowhere land.
Yeah, very well put. Hey, you think about what did Ronald Reagan say? He said something like, "It's only worked in two places: in heaven where they don't need it, and in hell where they already have it." So,
Yeah, exactly.
that's where we're. But the involvement and the engagement in politics, and this actually cuts across to a separate topic, and that is actually everyone always asks me, what do we do, Max? What do we do about the fraud and this and that? I get this all the time, and I've long since moved on from looking at 2020 and trying to relitigate that in my mind, if not in a court. The court cases and all that being dismissed mean nothing to me. It's over. The thing is that if you're wondering how do we fix it, and you have to think forward and you go, okay, you got to start at the local level. And we're talking specifically in the states where these problems happen. You saw Georgia, I think it was yesterday or I think it was last night.
See, yeah, this morning I saw they're restructuring their laws to.
Yes, yep. They repealed no absentee. They banned basically no absentee. They banned no excuse absentee voting. Right. Which was the foundation for the vote by mail, which is what caused all the problems that you have in Georgia and together. I mean, they're getting a lot of heat from the left that are just like falling over themselves to criticize that decision. And it was along a party line vote. The Republicans did it.
Mm-hmm. And they also put in, I think, voter ID was one of the things that they're.
They were going to do voter ID. I don't know if they include that in that bill, because I don't know.
I believe they did. I don't quote me on it, but I thought I saw that they did.
I don't. Yeah, I can't be certain. But yeah, I mean I know that was on the table. I remember that was one of the things they were looking at to get back to the signature verification. Yeah. That's the thing, and you got to put pressure on the state legislatures. I remember back in November and December, I was posting all those numbers over and over. I don't know how many people remember that, because I was doing it all the time. But I was putting them out there, and these are all the state legislatures. I would have them in Google Docs. People need to just find out. I mean, and if they come from out of state, something I tell people all the time, if you're from Texas and call up the Georgia representatives in the Georgia Republican Party, yes, and tell them, because this has to do with federal elections. So it impacts us nationally. It's a national issue. Their local election is going to impact us nationally. So yes, you could call up and you've got to tell them where you're from, sure, but it's like, say, hey, this is the way we're feeling and whatnot. And support candidates like Senator Mastriano in Pennsylvania. I hope he runs for governor, because they're going to, one way or the other, they're getting a new governor in 2 years, or actually next November, and he would be a great guy to clean up that state, the way he led the charge against the corruption during the quote unquote the investigations we never had during the post-election period we just suffered through, but the fraud period, if you want to call it,
right.
But this is its involvement, and it's going to be at the local level, and that's where it happens. I think you were asking me too at one point. You were asking me about whether there'll be an actual physical war or what will happen. Is that what you were asking me? If in the outcome? Yeah. I think, I do believe, I do honestly. I don't talk about it much because it's not my thing. I stick to it's not my shtick, if you would. I know Bannon talks about a lot. Yeah, Bannon talks a lot about the CCP, and I think the CCP, essentially the Communist Chinese Party, is infiltrating many levels of American society. I'm not ignorant of it. I'm very cognizant of it. I think people should be aware of it. I think we should talk more about it.
Yep.
And I ask on a personal level. I always ask questions, of people, and I interrogate, them when it comes to these areas, anything that has to do with Chinese dealings and whatnot, because the fact is that we know they've stolen our intellectual property. We know that they've planted spies in our government. We know our own politicians have had affairs with those spies and gotten away with it. All of this is gone. We know.
Naming names, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we know certain sons of certain presidents have been on the take and have made lots of money and stuff. We know this goes on, and they're very powerful. Now, it's interesting because they're the current threat to largely speaking, to the United States and to more broadly to Western civilization again. If we go back 30 years ago, or I should say maybe 35 years ago, it was the Soviet Union.
Sure.
If we talking about even then, 35 years ago, you're talking about technological threat, or I should say economic threat, you'd probably be more inclined to say Japan at that time if you're talking about Asia.
Yep.
So again, history dictates that, civilizations rise and fall, everything ebbs and flows. So that's how I view it. And so history does repeat itself, but the names change, so that's the real thing. And so, I mean, I don't know whether or not really red, quote unquote, China will actually be the superpower that fills the vacuum of a collapse in the United States. Mm-hmm. I do think that there's no profit in the Chinese government, the CCP, trying to fight a war with the United States. I think the communist mentality, to a certain level, is going to be practical. What does it profit them? I mean, if you go to war with the United States, first of all, they make all their money from us, so they need our markets, they need our cash,
our IP. They really need our IP.
They need IPs. They need so much stuff from us. So, a declaration of war, not an outright declaration. I don't see how that can practically work out. But let's just say an issue with Taiwan, the South China Sea, the waters, Japan gets involved. South Korea is always worried about everything. A conflict in East Asia, which I doubt any American ever wants to go back to that part of the world and fight a war again. We've already had 2 or 3 actually in that part of the world, if you count the Pacific Theater War during the war, World War II. But I mean, I don't think anyone's going to Asia and fight another war again. But I think that that something could happen over there that draws the United States. But they know that. They know the U.S. is going to get involved, or they, at least in some way, whether it's logistical or militarily, and it could hurt them. They already saw what one president can do just through executive action. He could cause a trade war that loses them hundreds of billions of dollars over a few years. So, I don't know. I think that, and I don't see, you have to understand, as much as some people talk about their military strength, they don't have the Navy we have. So, I laugh at that because, I mean, frankly, they'd have to rely on their massive Air Force, but they have 1 aircraft carrier or 2, 1 or 2. I don't know, but I think 1. They just don't. I mean, the firepower the United States has from its combined Navy and Air Force, it's just, I don't see any power on Earth really mixing with us. There's that, but it's so I don't know. I mean, I think that most of the problems we'll probably deal with is going to be internally. I think that will lead. That was my question.
Yeah. Do you see the internal civil? Yeah.
Yeah, I think. Look, when you have literally terrorist organizations that are heralded as some sort of great civil rights organization. I mean, I'm thinking of Antifa and BLM. When you have them marching with no hesitation through people's communities, burning down businesses, threatening people's lives, beating people up, killing police officers in some cases, burning down police stations, and the press coverage is nothing to see here, move on. It's something like Baghdad. You might as well get Baghdad Bob back. It's totally peaceful. And they're the most violent, peaceful people I've ever seen in my entire life. And then you have autonomous zones. That's scary. Because now you're really talking about the local law enforcement ceding authority to some basically domestic terrorists.
Yeah.
And
the brown.
Absolutely. And they're just ceding and they're walking away because, for whatever the combination of reasons that are causing them to not want to take, even for a Democrat, a leftist, to not want to control their neighborhoods. It's just something that 10 years ago, I would have thought you were crazy, even during the Obama era. No one's ever that suicidal. I mean, Obama had the beer summit, to make up for saying a nasty thing about a police officer. So, it's, that's scary. And they're ceding that authority. It's basically, I could see tribalism happening internally. Sociopolitically, if the United States, if law enforcement start to just say we've had enough, morale is already very low. There's not, once they're gone, once the local police walk away, there leaves a vacuum. There's an increase in crime. Yes, and so go ahead.
Certainly in the cities, especially, we're already seeing.
Absolutely. When that's where the urbanization which is already decaying, will then become a hotbed. It's already a hotbed for crime, because the more people you shove into an area, the more crime you're going to have. It's just simple math. But because you have more criminals and you're going to have more crime in a confined area. But what'll happen is those people go out and prey on the innocent. And eventually, I thought it was very creative, the autonomous zone, because you actually had these czars, essentially, right? These gang czars that took over whatever they called themselves. Well, I think one of them in particular I'm thinking of in Portland. And, was it Portland or was it Minneapolis? I don't remember which. I think it was Portland, right?
Portland. Chaz Top was in Portland.
Yeah. So, that's what you'll have. And you'll have more of that on a larger scale. And they'll walk around with AK-47s. And it'll look like something out of Escape from New York.
They're fine with guns for them. And they had borders, too.
Oh, yeah. They're really good. They put up walls. They build walls. That's what they do. They build walls to keep out the good guys. It's hilarious. It's literally, it looks like Escape on a small kind of like low budget way. It looks like they're trying to shoot Escape from New York 2 or 3, because we're Snake Plissken. But that's what I think what we would experience if things continue to slide. And we talk about secession. You think about there's all these movements for states to pull out. There is no mechanism for that. People often ask me about that. There's no, even in the Texas Constitution, it doesn't really say that. What I think people, but what may happen is if you had a cadre, if you would, of states from Florida to Texas, right. Which are basically, that's more than half of the U.S. economy in a sense coming from there, and they say, you know what, we're just going to do a tax revolt. We're not going to comply. You already have local sheriffs starting to say this in liberal states, right? Democrats say we're not going to enforce any federal gun confiscation legislation. So you start having that more and more. But why not? They let the genie out of the bottle already. The Democrats,
right?
When they refuse to enforce so many laws, whether it's from election laws, right, all the way to just go back to last summer to the riots, to just their own civil laws and protect people's businesses, they had police stand down. So, you could have a resistance, sort of like an aggressive version of what you saw in India in the 1940s under Gandhi, the 30s and 40s, where it was just this peaceful resistance, not an outright war. But if that happened in the
civil disobedience,
civil disobedience, exactly. And if you do that enough, you could basically force them to the bargaining table. That's a step that could actually happen too. And I think that can lead to some sort of a disassociation or a disunion of the states, which I don't advocate, because I'm a unionist, so I believe in going through the democratic, quote unquote, little d process and people voting. But again, circle back to it. It all gets down to us cleaning up our elections and fixing irregularities. So,
do you think there is much potential for that, especially now with HR 1, being pushed forward? What do you think the chances of us returning to some semblance of fair and honest elections are?
I think that HR 1 will fail. I still believe that. I hope I'm right. I hope you can come back to this and cite this. And I know. I think it will fail. I mean, there's like a 10% chance maybe it can pass in the Senate. But frankly, I know they float these ideas that the Bernie Sanders.
My concern. I'm sorry to interrupt you. My concern is actually, I do agree with you in the short term. But what I see them do so often is they push these really outlandish things, and usually they don't pass in the House or the Senate. But this time, this actually passed in the House. But they push these things. They present them, and then they keep pushing it under the table. So even though it may not pass right now, I'm concerned that it's almost like you put something forth that's so outlandish. Like you said, some of these things 5 years ago, we would have just thought you're absolutely crazy. But they put these things forth, so you become a little desensitized, and it becomes easier down the road to actually get it passed. And that's my concern with something like HR 1. But I am concerned about election integrity as a whole. But HR 1, I happen to agree with you. I'm hoping, really hope that it doesn't pass through. I don't think the chances are, that it will. I think that, it won't this time around. But I don't know moving forward, because I see that as a pattern.
Yeah, I think that when you look, again, the left are more aggressive. They're better at what they do. They're better organized in many ways. And they do try to keep pushing legislation. That's why I said it was a trial balloon. They keep putting it up. Now, just so you know, the House did pass a bill very similar to H.R. 1 about a year and a half, 2 years ago, and the Republican Senate just tabled it. The fact is that let's talk about, this is something that I know this concerns a lot. It's concerning a lot of people right now. Yeah. And they think it's just going to get through budget reconciliation and there's a lot of misunderstanding. Look, to pass anything in the Senate except budget issues, specifically money issues, okay? Money legislation. And even within that, it's limited. You need 60 votes. They don't have 60 votes. I'm just going to say that right now. Not one Republican voted for it in the House. Not one Republican in the Senate's going to vote for it. I would say in the Senate, you probably have a more conservative caucus on this issue than you do in the House, more unified conservative caucus. This issue is toxic to the GOP. They're never going to support it. Any Republican that stands there and votes for it is going to be ostracized within the party in Congress. So they're not going to go near. That's why not one House Republican voted for it. Not just because of the practical effect it's going to have, in which we know it's going to create a perpetual Democrat supermajority forever, and that's the end of the United States. And whether that actually happens, this idea of a permanent Democrat majority, there's books going back to that to the 1990s. Actually, further back, you can go back to the 70s, the emerging Democrat majority, and it just never happens because demographics are destiny, they say, quote unquote. Yes,
but if the elections are, if we don't have, election integrity.
Yeah, you could do fraud and openly. You could just make up votes, right? And you manufacture votes. Yeah, that's why they're looking. Look, Democrats aren't stupid. Again, I think in a lot of cases they're more rational and smart than some of the people on the inside. Anyways, they're thinking through things, right? That's how the socialists are taking over local parties, and the fact is, and we're sleeping through it in these states. I don't know where the resistance is, the conservative resistance is to that, but. They looking at the demographics. They're looking at Latino voters. They're seeing how Trump, who was just out there, right? You knew what he was thinking. You didn't know what he was thinking, but you know how he felt about issues. And so he's been labeled every kind of name under the which he was not a racist.
He didn't mince words.
He didn't mince words. Yeah, he didn't mince words. And yet he does tremendous with Latinos. I mean, I forget, he didn't do 32%. He got about 35 to 38% of the Latino vote, if we're being honest. And so, second only to George W. Bush in 2004. And that was a different time, frankly. So here's Trump coming out with his strong rhetoric. Look what he did in Florida. I mean, he basically, in Florida levels, 4 or 5% victory is like a landslide in Florida.
I know.
And so, the fact is that, Donald Trump, he got so close. I mean, the idea that he lost Miami-Dade by, I think, less than 10 points. I mean, come on, that's like a landslide for a Republican. And so, this is why that's just one example of one of the reasons why Biden lost the state in an honest election. And that was because he was driving the Latino vote. There are a lot of Latinos, a lot of Hispanics out there from different cross sections, largely Venezuelan and Cuban, but also other groups. And he did better probably with Mexicans. This is a man who really and then of course the African-American vote, we know he increased that. Everybody admits that. Even in DC, he doubled his vote in DC. And that was driven partly by his increase in African-American voting share. Totally. So this is a guy that's why I often say he's one of the most racially sensitive presidents. One of the reasons, the presidents we've ever had, and he's very sensitive to that, and he knows how to appeal. And he's using universal language too. He's doing it through what no matter who we are. It's not a racist issue. It's not a black or white issue. Security, law and order, security, economics, jobs, right? It's very simple language. That's what everybody wants, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, just very simple. And, it's not what bathroom you're using. And it's not with, I don't want to get into all of that. but it's not these other issues. It's like, because, hey, the best answer for, unemployment is a job, right? And a good paying job at that. And that's what he was after. And that solves a lot of people's problems. It's sort of universal. But so as far as HR1 goes, I think with regards to that, people need to, right off to your audience and everybody, just remember they need 60 votes to pass it. You're not going to get one Republican vote. I don't know if they have every Democrat on board for that. I would not be surprised if I'm Joe Manchin. I know he speaks out of 3, 4, 5 sides of his mouth. On the bottom line is I don't think he votes for it as a standalone bill. I think it's political suicide for him, and he knows that. He barely got reelected 2 years ago. He'd basically be done politically if he starts going down the Schumer road. I know he's under tremendous pressure to bend. I think he should just leave the Democratic Party and become a traitor, basically, and a political traitor, and become a Republican. I think it would save him and his career. Make a deal with Mitch McConnell. But they simply don't have the 10 votes, and so they need those, even if they get every Democrat on board. We know Kristen Sinema is sort of a maverick. She kind of wants to inherit that John McCain mantle. She may or may not vote for it. But I wouldn't be surprised at the end of the day if the Democrats are short by at least 12 votes. Now, can they use budget reconciliation for it? I think Bernie Sanders said that the other day. Look, and I could be wrong. It may not have been him. Look, it can't be done. It's not going to be done. You could say it's an economic issue. The parliamentarian is going to rule against it. And a lot of people don't understand the process in the Senate. The parliamentarian has to make judgment calls as to what can be added to the budget or what can be passed under simple budget reconciliation rules, which takes 51 votes. The parliamentarian is not an elected official. They tend to, the current one, I believe, is a Republican, but be that as it may, they're supposed to be nonpartisan, really, but be that as it may, the fact is that he or she is simply not going to, they just shot down the $15 minimum wage, which we could make a rational argument has something to do with economics. So, and it's on, when it comes to voting, no way, they're just not going to do it. Now, the presiding officer, which is technically the vice president, the president of the Senate, she can override. You can override. Yep. I don't know if the president pro temp can do it, but I know the vice president can override the parliamentarian. However, at that point, if you do that, what you're essentially doing is you have to make an option. If you want to kill the filibuster outright.
I was going to ask about that. Yeah, the filibuster.
Immediately, that's what you have to do. You have to kill the filibuster because
they're trying. They're trying to do that.
Okay, but the problem with killing the filibuster is they need 51 votes to do that. You immediately lose Manchin, and you immediately lose Kristen Sinema, who simply, she's a person that in that case, she will never compromise that. Look, she's in an awkward state. She's in Arizona. It's a state that is slowly becoming more Democrat, but again, people don't understand this about Arizona. It was a very heavily Democrat state. A lot of people probably don't know about Arizona. Arizona was actually a Confederate territory during the Civil War, so it has a very strong Democrat base to it. There's a strong sense there, especially in the Phoenix area. So it's like yes, but at the other hand, there's still a heavy Republican and now more ever MAGA group of people, voters, voting bloc there. So, it's something where she's got, and I think personally, she understands that, look, she's thinking long term, and so is Joe Manchin. In 2 years, we could be in the minority. So what would happen if the Republicans take both houses of Congress in 2022 and just start shoving legislation with no filibuster to stop it? Now, we know that Biden will be vetoing it, but he only has 2 more years left on his term. So, and he's only a one-term president, in my opinion, because I don't think he'll run for re-election. But, I think it's going to be an open race in 2024, separate conversation. But so, I mean, I think people like Manchin and Sinema, maybe someone else will be thinking a little long-term. I think also, too, you got to remember there are a lot of Democrats up for re-election in 2022 that don't want to necessarily kill off the filibuster, pass voting reform that's going to get they may be in Trump states. I think I'm not certain. I haven't looked at the roster very closely lately. So, but yeah, I think there's a lot against it. Can it happen? Yeah, they could kill they have to kill the filibuster to do it. They'd have to have Manchin and Simona on board, 50 votes plus the vice president. They kill the filibuster, but that's it. Once they do that, there's no going back. If the Republicans ever get control of Congress again in the White House, there's nothing to stop any legislation. They could pass whatever they want. And, they killed the filibuster for the federal judiciary, for the Supreme Court. What did that lead to? That led to Trump stacking the courts. So,
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. What do you think are some of the biggest, I guess the most dangerous policies that are being put forth now?
I think HR 1 is one of them, of course. I think, socioculturally, I would say there's not really many policies. If they're mostly, everything's been executive orders, executive fiat, which is meaningless. It's a joke, right? So, I guess this emphasis on, getting involved in people's sexuality and their gender identity and stuff is unnecessary, undue amount of attention being paid to these issues that should be left up to families and local officials and local communities to make a decision. If I'm using the PC political, response to it, I think it's just stupidity, frankly, if I'm being quite honest. I mean, I don't know what we're all talking about here. I tend to be a realist, and so I think these issues here just I think they just make us look weird, frankly, on in front of the world. But that's just my opinion. They're more pertinent.
They follow the Marxist blueprint. That's really what it is.
It's all about cultural Marxism. Yeah. Yeah, it is, and that's what it's about: dividing people and trying to break everyone down. And that's fine. I believe in breaking everybody down and studying their in subgroups, which is, as an archaeologist, what you do, and anthropologists do that. But it's like when you apply it to politics, and it's like, why are you going out of your way to divide people? And I can't believe how divided people are 20 years after 9/11. I just shake my head, and it's just I can't believe it. And it's been a succession of presidents that have been divisionary. So I'm using my own word there. From Bush to Obama, who I think did the most damage. I think Bush set up the stage with his endless wars, and then Obama came in and was just basically, Obama was a reverse racist. So that he just had, I think he just played up all sides just to get his agenda across, which I'm glad a lot of it didn't pass.
Reverse racism is like some weird term. It's I wouldn't even say it's an oxymoron, because it just doesn't have any meaning. It's still racist. Like,
it is racist.
The definition of racism doesn't apply to like a specific race,
I agree. That's a good way of looking at it. I remember Rush using the term in the past, so that's why I picked it up as a kid. He would always he would say that periodically.
I understand it. I just wanted to point out the absurdity of it. It's like
it is. It's just racism, right? It's just anytime the people talking about race are the ones that are usually the racists. So, they're the ones that pointing out all the racism are usually the race, because they're the ones that are always seeing the world through a prism of color. And, so, I'm like, why are you reducing everyone to their skin color and their gender now, or their gender identity? I don't understand why they do that. I don't care if you're a white woman, or if you're a black man, or if you're a Latino, or I just don't care. I'm up kind of like, this is like an old school streak from my childhood. But you remember, don't ask, don't tell. It's sort of like, I don't really. Why do you have to tell me about what goes on in your bed? I'm sorry, I don't know the age of your audience, but why do you have to tell me what goes on in your bedroom? I don't want to know. Why does that have to be put on a label next to your name?
Exactly. Heterosexual couples don't go and tell everyone what's going on in their bed. Why? Yeah, it just doesn't make sense.
It doesn't, and it's just like, I think you said, it's just, these are political movements. This is what it's like. It's like COVID-19, and I believe it's a disease. It's a disease. I just think that it's
a disease too, by the way. So is the cold.
I'm sorry, say that again. Say that. I didn't hear you.
The flu is a disease, by the way.
Right. Right.
We have lots of diseases, and people actually die of the flu. Although we cured the flu, 22, we cured the flu. So
yeah, of course. What I mean is, I was going to say that this is the difference between the flu, though, and COVID. The flu is just a disease. Mm-hmm. COVID is a political disease.
Yes.
It's been politicized. So that's the thing. It's a political disease. So it's being treated differently. Because when you think about it, well, You're right.
I call COVID the communist virus disease.
Well, you know what? It is true because it came from that part of the world. And I do believe, and this is just me, and this is as far as I'll go with a conspiracy theory. I don't think it's a conspiracy theory, frankly. There was too much. What happened to the people that were researching it? What happened to some doctors who disappeared that had a knowledge of it? They disappeared, right? We know this is a communist country. People wake up. It's a totalitarian state. They're human rights abusers. That is general common knowledge. Everyone knows about it. I mean, it is what it is. They lie. Remember during the whole height of the crisis when there was constantly this, they had those maps up of the COVID crisis. You could go online, you'd see them of everybody dying or getting sick of COVID. China was stuck. I don't know if anybody remembers that. China was stuck on a certain number for weeks and weeks and weeks. They simply weren't reporting. They weren't reporting all the cases. I mean, people, they lie. They're propagandists. This is what a communist country does. It's what the Soviet Union did.
Yep.
And so,
Nazi Germany did. Absolutely.
Nazi Germany. Absolutely. So, it's something where you look at that and then, could it have been developed or could they have taken an existing virus and altered it in some way? Yeah, listen, it's not science fiction. That stuff can go, and you can weaponize common biological organisms. That's what's called biological warfare. So, there's a whole field of study into that, and it's a whole military wing as well. And, that sort of happens. But this is, again, but it's a political disease, and it's a convenient political. It helped the Democrats. I believe if that hadn't happened, for certain, there would have been no vote by mail. There would have been no reason for it. These states would have never adopted it. States like Georgia, Arizona, Republican states like that wouldn't have given any permission for it. That wouldn't have happened. I think that the turnout would have been down. And I say turnout down. Turnout would have been about the same. Only thing is you wouldn't have had Joe Biden getting these exuberant numbers. He did better than with certain groups of people that in certain parts of the country than Barack Obama did at the peak of his popularity in 2008, which is an absolutely impossible. It's just not impossible. It's just highly improbable. Yeah. So, it's no, Joe Biden, so this would have been, I think Trump would have won in a hand. Look, Trump got at least 75 million votes. In my opinion, it was clearly he was heading towards landslide territory. Yeah. And I don't get into the whole thing where he would have won California too and everything. People get a little crazy, but I think in New York he did.
I will tell you, they made it legal to cheat in California with the ballot harvesting. So
that's true. California is interesting, right? So there's that state there. They have that jungle primary, which I think is ridiculous. Yep. And then they also have motor voter, right? That was I think that was one of the first states that ever did it. And then they have ballot harvesting now. That was something new they added, and then the endless counting and stuff. So sure, you can inflate the number. Look, if we go back to 2016 and past elections, I would say California probably had the higher level of illegal voting out of most of the states. That just have a larger population, but and it's probably coming mostly from Los Angeles, specifically
and San Francisco. Yeah,
and to a lesser degree, San Francisco. Absolutely, yeah. So that's where all that's coming from. That's where the corruption is too. And needless to say, those are some of the, especially LA is one of the worst cities crime-wise. So in the country. Mm-hmm. Rivals New York in many ways. Well, New York, New York now, not during Rudy's era. It's bad a few years ago. But yeah, that reminds me. I was going to say a minute ago too. The president actually got 43% of the vote. I think it was in New York. So he was in the 30s in 16. So yeah, this is a guy who was doing better across the board, and he was definitely for him to win Florida, Texas, Ohio by a landslide in Ohio, and Iowa, and not win the general election. No, come on. The probability, it's never happened before.
The bellwether counties. Yeah.
No, it's never happened before. That's why I don't bother going into it and talking about it's just not my thing. And I know this is like toxic for YouTube and stuff, but I just don't talk about these things. This is all like, I know this already. It's, and we've had controversial elections. Everyone, look, the 1960 election was an election that was controversial, that a lot of historians believe was stolen.
Tried to stop Lincoln from getting his second term using mail-in ballots.
Say that last. I'm sorry. Say the first part of that.
They tried to impede Lincoln from getting his second term by through mail-in ballots.
Yeah, the thing. Yeah, you just these things
Not
happen.
new.
No, it's there is always an element of fraud. It's just the magnitude of it, the size of it. I don't believe there was widespread fraud. I think that is a misnomer. I think it was tactical, strategically done in certain cities, and that's the end of it. I think that's they knew which cities they had to target. They targeted that Milwaukee, Detroit, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Atlanta, Phoenix, pretty much the whole state of Nevada, and Las Vegas and whatnot. They just knew where to go. They didn't have to go throughout the whole state, and that's why I thought when people went around saying, "Oh, widespread fraud," and I'm like, no, it wasn't widespread fraud. It was tactical, strategic. It was in different areas, and eventually, I believe, if you get the right people in there, they can reform those areas. And that's we've had look. There've been corruption in cities, and there've been attempts at stealing elections, and many times in U.S. history, going all the way back. We had, I think 1796 was the first controversial election. That was because it was basically you had John Adams win, and you had Thomas Jefferson as the runner-up come in as the vice president, and there were a lot of unhappy electors and a lot of unhappy bureaucrats and whatnot. So then the 1800 election was, of course, it's a contingent election. So when Jefferson won, that wasn't even decided by the electoral college. It was decided by the House of Representatives, and that's what made that election very controversial. So there's going right back to our founding. We've had issues with our election system. So, and I talk a lot about this in the seminar. So.
Yeah. Yeah. So, well, this has been awesome. Would you have anything else you want to add? Definitely tell everybody about your seminars, which are awesome. And I will just say, from my personal experience, one of the things I do love is the Socratic method, because I feel like that's very much lost. I think that children today in the education system are really taught what to think, not how to think. And I think that method engages people, so they're forced to start to ask questions and start to think about the material in ways that they otherwise wouldn't if they're just being spoon-fed. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, well, I just what I do besides everything else is I've noticed that because there are so many people out there that don't have a general knowledge, even a basic knowledge, and it's not their fault. It's the education system, and it's also their jobs and their constraints. It's a combination of things. I mean, I'm involved in it now because I kind of grew up in the environment, but I'm always learning new things. And I had to go back even during this last election and do a lot of research specifically on the electoral college. I had to dig deeper in that because I knew it was going to come down to that, but I wanted to understand all of the little intricacies and all of the little ceremonies that were invested in it, and what the precedents for it. So I do teach. I have taught American history before, but I teach civics to adults, and I actually
not taught it in school anymore.
It isn't taught in school anymore, right? So I actually do, and I do this online, largely private tutoring and teaching for people on civics. And I started these seminars, and so the first one I did, I think, was in January, and you attend. Oh, you actually, I think did you attend the first one, or you attended the first one, right? I think was it
I think the first one.
So you attended the first one. So I do that, and I call it Civics Maximus, which I thought was funny. It came to me one day when I was trying to figure out what to call it. Civics Maximus. I added the 101, Civics 101 or Civics Maximus 101. And it's basic. It's 2 to 3 days, depending on the month. I'm starting to just get into a rhythm of doing them every other month. And people are welcome to contact me at Maximus _ and then the number 4, and then it's EVR on Twitter. And I'm also on Parler at Maximus, the number 4 EVR, no underscore. I'm on Gab too. I don't log in as often as I should, but the same as my Twitter handle at Maximus, the underscore, the number 4 EVR. And they can contact me. They can DM me directly and talk to me about it. And I have a lot of people show up for them, so I'm doing those. And we go through, democracy versus republic. It's a short kind of like subtitle to it. We basically spend a lot of time throughout the entire 2 to 3 days, depending on the month, talking about Socratically, interrogating the history of and the different aspects or characteristics of both a democracy and a republic. And I do this comparative contrasting analysis between everybody, between the two different, between the two different political systems. And then, of course,
great because sorry to interject, but it's great because the left loves to say that we're a democracy and our democracy needs to be preserved, and that's not really accurate. We are a democratic republic or a constitutional republic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's because these are again two different systems, and again, it's easy to say it, and we talk about that. We talk about the fact what is a democracy, and again, I go back to classical Athens, and we go right down, and with regards to that, we always have to add context. I mean, what were the people like that adopted this system? Oligarchy was there, and they had tyranny. And we go through all these other systems, and I mean, we come right down to the present day. Discussing the practical application of this. We spend a good deal of the second or third day discussing election reform and the history of elections in the United States. We talk about the Bill of Rights. We talk about the 14th Amendment, which I often include with the Bill of Rights because so much changed with the adoption of the 14th Amendment. All against the backdrop of American history, and of the founding fathers and who these men and women were. And then, of course, the political parties. What is it to be a Republican or a Democrat? So this is Civics Maximus is a really good seminar. I highly recommend it to anyone that has questions or wants to learn more. It's sort of like a crash course. And then that is something else I do too. I do random crash courses. I'm starting to get into like an off month with those. What I'm doing is I did a bunch last month and I'll do some next month. Mm-hmm. And people can they can contact me and reach out to me to if they want to just do like a 2 or 3 hour crash course on civics, we can do that. The other thing is I have my next seminar, and just so you know, your audience knows, the next one is actually going to be March 26th or the 27th. That's the next time we're doing civics. So it'll be Friday and Saturday on the 26th and the 27th of this month. And then next month, we're doing my big, this will be the first time I'm covering this topic. This is going to be for those history lovers out there. 3 days, April 22nd to the 24th, will be a seminar on basically medieval seminar. It'll be on a topic I like to talk about. And I'm calling it Knight, or I should say Samurai versus Knight, the life of a medieval warrior. And we'll be talking about the codes of Bushido and the code of chivalry. And we'll be putting this at the backdrop of Buddhism and Christianity. And it will be this constant yin-yang, if you would, back and forth, but over 3 days between basically the lifestyle and the environment, the social and economic environment of the people. We'll be talking about their philosophical beliefs, their arts and architecture, and we'll be talking about their warfare, their weapons, and their combat, the martial arts, and comparing, essentially medieval knighthood with Bushido. And I think it's going to be very fascinating. So if anyone's interested in attending that, they can as well. I'm hoping you come too, because I know you've been there for you've been making all my seminars. So I hope you actually, you're invited.
I have. Yeah. Hopefully I will be, that sounds right up my alley, something I would really enjoy. So hopefully I will be able to.
Yeah, please do. We'll talk more about that too. Yeah. So on a one-on-one. So, but anyways, but hey, thanks for having me. This has been very fun, and this has been a really good debate, and we got to do it again sometime. If you have me back on your show, and I hope I really am. Congratulations on the show. I know you had the editor of the Gateway Pundit on the other day, as I remember.
I did.
That's cool. How did you get him on that? How did you land him? He posted. It was on his website, right? He put the whole.
He did. Yeah. So I have some mutual friends. And so.
Cool. That's cool. Congratulations. I'm glad you did. I'm waiting. You have to get Bannon on your show, and you got to have him come on.
I would love that. That would be amazing.
Got to get Dad on your show, as I call him Dad all the time.
You're right. So we'll just explain that you call Steve Bannon your dad.
Yeah. I do that. I do that as a joke. It was an online joke because he reminds me of my dad, at least politically. And so, I say that on my podcast sometimes, and I said, yeah, Dad, quote unquote, and I always qualify. He's not my dad. But I did that. It was like a internet rumor. I started that is because I was watching his show every day during the election crisis. And I would just say things he said, and people would start going, yeah, who are you? And then I just started one day just saying, oh, Dad said this. And they're like, what, who, what? And that's how that began as a joke. So
I thought you meant your dad when you kept saying dad. And I'm like,
no, I follow. Yeah, people believe things so quickly. So I had to follow up within a short time with, oh, and I would just qualify it, and I stopped doing it after I was like, he's not my dad, okay? It's just like, it's not. It's just, he looks like Dad up there. And I think it was some people actually saying to me something about, his hair and this and that, and they were like, and somebody was mentioning their dads, and that's how I just came up with it one night as a joke. But anyways, I dropped it after a while. But yeah, you got to get him on your show one time. It would be great if he was to actually show up on your show. So.
Oh, that would be amazing. Yeah, I love him. Yeah, that would be really awesome. So yeah, Jim was incredible. He's such a nice guy, and obviously, a wealth of information. He was fantastic. So
there's the Gateway Pond. There's a group that have really been on the front lines going after all this corruption. So that's really awesome. That's really awesome.
They're not backing down. That it's true journalistic integrity. I have tremendous respect. Yeah.
Yeah, it's true. That's true. That's true. But anyways, it's been great, and take care of yourself and keep plugging along. Okay.
All right. Thank you so much. And I should have said this in the beginning. I'll put a little note, but thank you so much for coming on. And, we put the picture to respect your privacy. So I appreciate that you're willing to at least have your voice be here with us today. So.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you so much. Take care of yourself now.
Yeah.